Morning, everyone. Wow, my voice carries. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to yell. I feel like a judge, with those hammers. And I always feel bad about interrupting people. This is like we could do another hour of just conversations. Post-COVID, people love this. My understanding, the minister is supposed to arrive around 9:15, which is why we've moved the agenda. If you look at the agenda line, you can look at the QR code. You can find all the speakers' bios. You can find a copy of the agenda. We did move the first half by 10 minutes. So the break will be around 9:45 instead of 9:35. At 9:45, you have a virtual reality table that I've had set up. There are only 2 sets, and they last about 15 minutes. So please see Jean or Carmina, someone from IFAD, if you're interested, at the break. Bathrooms, that kind of thing. Please have your phones off. If you have to take the call, please take it outside. I understand fully, it's not an issue. If you're hungry, get up. The second half is more of a classroom. It's a discussion, it's a dialogue, it's free. Raise your hand right away, you have a question, like in class. Don't wait till the very end, there's no question period. I want it to be dynamic, that's how I am. So I wanted to thank, first of all, none of this would be possible if I didn't have Gloria and Camino. If you want to just raise your hands so people can recognize you. A big thank you. I appreciate that because, you know how many hundred of hours go into this kind of thing. Our thanks to our partner who funded the breakfast workshop. I don't see Jean, but big thank you to Jean and IFAD and Carmine and the AOL office in Washington. Hey, Jean, a big thank you to you and for your support. For those of you following us online, we do have live interpretation. If you look at the globe on Zoom at the bottom right, there's like a sphere, and you can pick your language there. On site, if any of you need headsets, we have them in the back. We have 25 headsets, so there's lots. And so that allows for people to understand French or Spanish or English. The interpretation's out of Costa Rica today, out of headquarters, next door. We're in a fantastic venue, so a big thanks to our hosts, and I'll pass it over to Carrie Lee.
Thank you, Jean-Charles. Thank you, Jean-Charles. Hello, my name is Carrie Lee Burchell. As the Director General of the Canada Agriculture and Food Museum, I'm honored that we were chosen as the venue for such an important event. As one of the 3 national museums of science and innovation under the Ingenium banner, we welcome all of the thought leaders in this room today and online, wherever online is. As you discuss one of the key issues of our time, which is food security, please know that the museum is a willing partner when it comes to sharing information with consumers and inspiring future generations of the scientists, agronomists, farmers, and community leaders that will continue to feed, clothe, and power a planet amidst growing concerns for sustainable agriculture, climate action, and equity. Avant de commencer aujourd'hui, je voudrais reconnaître que ce musée est situé sur le territoire ancestral et non cédé de la nation Algonquin-Anishinaabe. Le personnel des établissements et les visiteurs apprécient le fait de pouvoir...
The staff of the facilities also thanks you for working in this location. I would like to thank Charles Ling and AICA for organizing this session today and for bringing so many important people to discuss issues that are connected to the SDGs of the UN. I go back to English again.
For organizing this event in honor of IFAD's president, Dr. Alvaro Lario's visit to Canada. Jean-Charles told me I had 2 extra minutes, so I'm going to capitalize on those. The museum's also very pleased to partner with Agriculture Agri-Food Canada on this beautiful site known as the Central Experimental Farm. As both a National Historic Site and an active research station, this 400-hectare space in the heart of Canada's capital city certainly demonstrates the importance of agriculture and its link to our quality of life. For 137 years, the Central Experimental Farm has been actively researching and working with producers across Canada to develop the most innovative and sustainable solutions for production in Canada. This October will mark the museum's 40th anniversary on the site, and we certainly can't think of more appropriate panel discussions than this when we're talking about sustainable discussion and looking at innovations that will help us continue to feed the globe.
Agreed.
Merci, Jean-Charles.
Merci à toi, au contraire. Donc, en fait, ce qu'on fait, avant de commencer avec la ministre, qui n'est pas encore arrivée, de ce que je vois, IFAD a un vidéo. Gloria, s'il te plaît. Merci.
Gloria, go ahead with the video, please.
Natural disaster, climate change, failed harvests, a global pandemic. For more than 40 years, IFAD has helped small-scale producers weather the worst shocks, improve incomes, and feed their families. IFAD is currently helping 128 million poor rural people across the world. From digging wells to planting forests, from building roads to re-greening ecosystems, empowering women and young people, supporting the rights of indigenous groups. We provide tools and training. We help farmers and producers gain the knowledge and resources they need to sustain their communities. IFAD fights poverty and hunger, and our mission is now more important than ever.
Thanks. I really feel privileged to be surrounded by friends and partners. Adika, it's good to see all of you. And I wanted, it's tough because we don't meet enough and we don't collaborate and coordinate sufficiently. So I'm hoping this event today will spark more of that discussion with Ika, amongst yourselves. And we will start off. The minister will come and go. She cannot stay and take questions. IFAD cannot take questions, but Lloyd Day will have a presentation and will take questions. So I'd like to welcome the Honourable Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Madame Marie-Claude Bibeau, and the President of IFAD, Alvaro Lario. Please. Over here. Please. La parole est à vous.
Bonjour tout le monde.
Good morning, everyone. We have translations? Yes, perfect. So, I will then speak in French, but I will also try to speak a little bit of Spanish as well. I've not had an opportunity to speak Spanish. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you. I did not want to let more time goes by, but this to me is truly a pleasure. Every time we travel to international conferences, we need to exchange experiences with our colleagues and do our homework at another time. Dr. Eladio, dear guests, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Next year, we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the agricultural development in a context of climate change and growing population. It's important to finance innovation projects and agricultural projects to increase productivity and the resilience of our farmers everywhere. The mission is essential. We need to support farmers and contribute to increasing their income and well-being, quality of life worldwide. Cooperation between Canada and IFAD has led to many results. I think that together we have improved access to financing for small farmers and small entrepreneurs. This shows the resilience in light of climate change and also the socioeconomic improvements we've supported. I acknowledge IFAD's important input in increasing the projects involving Indigenous people and priority groups. This is also an important step in Canada. Last year,
and Agriculture, ICA. ICA continues to do vital work in improving food security, promoting trade, and building prosperity in the Western Hemisphere. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Canada Agriculture and Food Museum today. Thank you also for welcoming us here to learn more about Canada's history on innovation in science and technology in agriculture. For example, in the 1980s, Canadian farmers led the world in adopting conservation tillage technology, which helped reduce soil erosion, carbon emissions, and fuel and water use. Today, more than ever, the world needs innovative ideas to address the challenges faced by our farmers. Climate-related shocks to our agricultural sector are happening at the time when global food security is at greater risk than ever, due to, in large part, to Russia's war against Ukraine, which continues to affect global food and energy security through high food and input costs and other pressures. There's no doubt that we need to take urgent action to build a more sustainable agriculture sector to feed the world. We are taking a collaborative approach that starts with the farmer. Our network of living labs across the country is bringing farmers and researchers together in the field to develop and test management practices that work in real farm conditions, to help address key areas impacting farmers, including soil health, water quality management, and crop productivity. Canada will continue to work with all partners to address immediate crises and lay the foundations for long-term resilience. Over the past couple of years, Canada has made significant new commitments to humanitarian food and nutrition assistance to help address the root causes of hunger, strengthen the resilience for the poorest and most vulnerable. This includes support for small and medium-sized agri-food enterprises in Africa, as well as grain storage and lab equipment purchases in Ukraine. And Canada has been active in the Americas too. Canada's development assistance has invested in a number of projects in the hemisphere. For example, Canada invested in a development research project in Colombia to produce more nutritious potatoes. And I remember visiting this field when I was Minister of International Development. That produced a potato variety that now replaced 16% of Colombia's potato production. It provided higher micronutrient levels to an estimated 8.6 million Colombians. Currently, Canada has invested $3 million in projects with smallholder women farmers in Nicaragua's dry corridor. This Canadian project and many others seek to simultaneously improve agriculture production, respond to environmental concerns, including climate change, reduce rural poverty, and empower rural women. And that project reflects Canada's development priorities. Our feminist international assistance policy, which I am so proud of, put a focus on empowering women and girls. In many parts of the world, they do the majority of agricultural labor, but are also most likely to be food insecure and most likely to lack access to land, capital, and inputs. Investing in women is also an investment in food security and agricultural sustainability. Canada's agricultural links with the countries in the Americas go beyond our trading and development relationships. Canada's agricultural sector relies on temporary foreign agricultural workers who are essential to the operations of our farms and agri-food businesses. The number of these workers has risen rapidly. In 2022, more than 70,000 were employed in Canada agri-food operations. Canada benefits from these temporary foreign agricultural workers. In addition to the job, some are able to learn, well, they do learn and develop new skills that they can apply in their own country. As one of the world's largest agricultural producers, Canada makes an important contribution to global food security, global food supply, and we are taking steps to use science and innovation to help all countries produce more. To help meet the world's growing demand for wheat over the past few months, Canada has been working with partners to develop the Wheat Research Accelerator Fund. This initiative with the IDRC, International Development Research Center, IDRC, seek to improve the sustainability of wheat production in Africa and the Middle East, especially countries which rely on Ukrainian grain. The other key to food security is trade. To feed the world sustainably, farmers will also need a global trading regime that is open, transparent, predictable, and based on rules and science. When climate shocks happen, we need strong trade networks and supply chains to support global food security. As we work together to transform our food systems, we will need everyone at the table. We must also make sure that women and youth are empowered so they can fully contribute to their communities. As Canada's first woman Minister of Agriculture, I make every effort to include women, youth, young people, Indigenous peoples, and other groups in the discussion. Para terminar, Canadá segura apoyando
And in closing, Canada continues to support the important work of AICA and also of the International Fund for Agricultural Development to set in motion projects for agricultural development that can support millions of people worldwide and to improve their lives. You have the full commitment of Canada to support food security worldwide. We are developing, and we want to continue cooperating with you, because this way we will be able to feed the world in a sustainable manner. Once again, thank you for this opportunity. I've had the opportunity of getting to know Álvaro Hilario, the president of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, during the meeting of agricultural ministers that was held. The International Fund for Agricultural Development is an important cooperator, strategic partner for Canada in order to support developing countries to reduce food insecurity, reduce poverty, and to strengthen resilience in light of climate change, paying particular attention to rural communities that are the poorest and most marginalized worldwide. Please let us welcome Dr. Álvaro Hilario.
Bon, merci beaucoup, Madame la Ministre. Maintenant, je ne sais pas si je devrais parler en anglais, en français ou en espagnol, mais bon.
Thank you, Minister. I don't know if I should speak English, Spanish, or French. I think that I'm going to start in English, and I think that everybody here speaks Spanish, but I will try to say a few words in French and in Spanish as well, because after you, Minister, it's difficult to speak.
Organizing this session, and to Minister Bibot for her leadership, now at the Minister of Agriculture, and before on her work as a previous minister, and on your leadership on the feminist international policy. Thank you very much. A warm welcome to all of you here today. I'm honored to be joining you on behalf of IFAD to discuss the important role of family farming on achieving global food security. Conversations like the one we're having today are integral to achieving a world free of hunger. And thank you, all of you, for the session that we're having. For 45 years, IFAD has targeted the areas where poverty and hunger are deepest, in the most remote regions of developing countries and fragile situations where few development agencies venture. IFAD's mission is to tackle the root causes of poverty and hunger in developing economies. Canada has provided IFAD with a long-standing support throughout the years to address hunger, poverty, and climate change. With Canada's strong support, IFAD has become a leader in rural women empowerment, with women now accounting for 50% of participants in IFAD-funded programs. Let me now also provide a little bit of an overview of the work with family farming, the topic of today. Family farmers have a special place in IFAD's work to end rural poverty and hunger, because 80% of the world's poorest people live in rural areas. They depend on small-scale agriculture for their livelihood, food security, and nutrition. Not all family farms are small, but all small farms are family farms. This means that family farms have a central role to play in transforming food systems, because those very farms are estimated to produce over a third of the world's food calories, and around 70% of the world's people depend on small farms for the food they eat. That's around 5 billion people. In Latin America and the Caribbean, over 60 million family farmers are working hard to feed the region. Still, food insecurity affects 40% of the people in Latin America and the Caribbean, compared to a global prevalence of 29%. Small farms therefore have the potential to play an integral role in ameliorating this situation, and this role is going to become bigger and more important as we face challenges like population growth, climate change, conflict, and a host of other shocks to our food systems. At IFAD, we believe that building resilient food systems depends on small family farms, and we know that small family farms can be remarkably productive. But for these farmers to succeed, they need access to markets, to infrastructure, and to financial services, to new ideas and technologies for improving climate change resilience, and to more knowledge so that they can graduate from subsistence to prosperity. Inaction will be expensive. For every dollar that is spent in medium-term resilience and in family farms, we can save up to $10 of humanitarian assistance. We know it is possible. We see the results over and over again in the projects and programs that IFAD supports in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also elsewhere. As an example, our work with ICA, we have, for example, supported small-sized enterprises and smallholder rural producers in transitioning to a climate-smart agriculture production. We have also together improved knowledge management for adaptation of family farming to climate change. And we have provided prompt assistance for food assistance and employment generation to rural areas in Haiti after the devastating earthquake in 2010. A better future is possible, and investing in small-scale farmers can lift millions of people out of poverty. We have a lot of work to do to achieve the 2030 agenda, and our time frame is limited. The road ahead will be a challenging one, but the possibility of working together and achieving these milestones will give me a lot of motivation and inspire me and millions of people forward. I look forward to hearing your views so we can tackle food insecurity together, and I wish you a good session. Thank you very much.
Are you open to having any questions, or would you
I wish I could, but I have to run in 2 minutes.
Of course. On the contrary, thank you for your
Well,
answer.
I really wish I could stay.
C'est un plaisir. Lloyd. One moment, please. Well, while they're taking a picture, anybody want to ask a question to the minister? Any hands up? Okay. ¿Se puede quedar un ratito o se tiene que ir luego los dos? Okay. The President is open to having some questions to him before he meets. He has bilateral meetings next door. Family farming, the Americas, food security. Please go ahead, Soko Devi. Plus fort.
Andrea from Soko-Devi. I was just wondering what's IFAD's food security priority in Latin America?
Thank you very much. So for us, there's a number of priorities very much linked to the Americas, which are not that dissimilar to the rest of the world. The first one is how to connect many of these small farmers and family farms to the markets. That means to make sure that they are able to liaise with the private sector and that they also get in this type of relationships and partnerships a decent living wage, which is a very important part of the connection. Another important one relates to how they can adapt to climate and to biodiversity laws. That means how to work with nature and making sure we provide them with the tools and the financing, which many times is very expensive, to adapt to many of these extreme weather events. And I would also say access to finance. We are partnering with a number of national development banks, public development banks, agricultural development banks, and it's very important that we also make sure that the financing that they receive, it's at the volume and at the price that can also enable them to continue growing and drive their lives. So I would say those three come to mind very quickly.
Santiago.
Santiago Alon with IDFC. One of the challenges that we are seeing in Latin America in particular is the access to finance and the access to investment capacity for the farmers. We have a big flow of private finance and other kind of finance that is reaching the countries, but this is still an IFA to really reach this finance, the small holder farmer, going from the market to the market.
I think that's a very good question. Indeed, I always say that we are an assembly of development finance, but with a purpose. It's not a matter only of volume. It's a matter of making sure that the financing gets to that last mile and reaches the real communities that need it. Many times we see, especially at the multilateral level, very much of the talk on trade finance and the very big pictures and the very big flows. But the important part is actually that many of these family farms have access to the financing. And also, that's why, for example, as an example, in Brazil, in our work, we very much don't work in all regions. We work in the 3 regions that are poorer and that are most affected by climate change as well as biodiversity loss. So it's not a matter of just being present. We need to be additional, and we need to make sure that we're making a difference to the communities, not just to the flows. And this is a very important message.
Please.
I think that's a great question. We are, there will be, as some of you might know, there's going to be a summit in Colombia on Financing Common, which is in September, which is like an alliance of different public development banks, financial institutions. Indeed, IFAD is leading on the agriculture development banks side, and for us it's very important actually to make sure that we go where it's more difficult, which to us is climate adaptation, private sector, smallholders, and in some cases in the world also least developed countries. But I was talking recently to a CEO of a private bank, and he was telling me actually what de-risks most our portfolio is actual training to the small farmers in terms of business and in terms of technology, because then once they have that, many times that's what prevents them from failing. So he was seeing training and capacity building as a way of de-risking his own credit risk portfolio. So for us, it's very important to work in the financing, in the training, and as I said, in a very targeted way. So we are trying to scale up in many of the most difficult places and many of the most difficult areas, and that means adaptation and private sector.
Thanks, Corey. Hugo?
Bonjour, Hugo Bourgal-Angelier, UPL Développement International. I was wondering, how do you see IFAD's role working directly with farmers' organizations in the South?
Well, for us, farmers' organizations are our partners. So usually we do design with the government, we design with the communities, but our key stakeholders, and I think the reputation we have is because we very much partner with farmers' organizations, with women associations, with women's cooperative, farmers' cooperatives. So for us, that's our key stakeholder, if I can name it so, because otherwise, as I said, the most important part is ownership by these communities. If we're going to just impose our measures, impose our solutions, they need to be part of the solution and part of also the type of expressing their needs. I mean, the needs are coming from them, not just from IFAD, not from the governments. They are the ones who actually know what they need. And the important part for us is to be an honest broker that actually brings them into the picture.
One more last question, Ian.
Mr. President, what a pleasure to have you in Canada. I spent some of the most fruitful years of my profession at IFAD, working with one of your predecessors. And I guess my question to you is, because we saw it so important at that time, that priorities change. And my question to you is, what priority does IFAD give to nutrition? Specifically, when one thinks of the correspondence that there is with climate change, with the push towards addressing the needs of women and girls. Many examples IFAD can put forward in terms of countries of where the dire conditions in terms of nutrition also reflect the dire conditions in terms of the role and treatment of women and girls. And it's a no-brainer. And so my question to you is IFAD serious about addressing the issue of feminization that is so important for Canada?
Thank you. So our four main streaming themes actually are nutrition, youth, climate, and gender. So those are the four areas. We have started actually some years ago, I don't know if you're familiar, doing impact assessments by which 15% of our portfolio, we measure actually what's the impact in many of these type of themes, including, for example, how many millions of people we raise their income, how many millions of people have access to markets, how many millions of people build resilience through household service. So actually we try to measure many of these aspects. In the case of nutrition, we started actually 3-4 years ago, and what we have, and the other ones perhaps 6-8 years ago to measure some of that impact, which is rigorous, it's challenging to get the results. But I would say it's for us very early still in the case of nutrition to have understood some of the implications for our programs. On the mixture of gender and nutrition, I would say what we have noticed, which might not come as a surprise to you, is actually that when women increase their income significantly, that has a huge implication for nutrition in the families, huge implication in terms of assistance to school, as an example. And we also have seen that it's not easy, obviously, but one of the things we can be more impactful is in raising the income of women. What is much more challenging is to have actually women have access to the land, to land rights, to the assets themselves. So the income side is easier. The assets relates to gender norms, to things that are much more complicated, to transforming the community. And that's our end role. We talk about hunger, we talk about poverty, but we really want to make sure that we're transforming the community, making rural economy still an engine of growth, an engine of job creation, because actually otherwise the consequences, and I was discussing it yesterday with some parliamentarians, why invest in IFA? Well, the consequences, the alternative is increased conflict, increased forced migration, increased number of challenges related also to population growth, and that's a reality and the trajectory is clear. And that means also increased investment, unfortunately, in humanitarian assistance. So for us, it's very clear we have to invest in local solutions, local job opportunities, and making people have the opportunity to choose what type of lives they can drive. So that relates very much to the point. Thank you.
Genial. Muchísimas gracias.
Merci beaucoup.
So we're going to follow up on the next item on our agenda. There's a presentation from our Deputy Director General, Lloyd Day, from Costa Rica. He's with us. He's just coming to the podium and the table. So he has a almost 10-minute presentation. So we can start the presentation, please. And I'll let you...
Sit there so I can see. Let's see. Maybe here's better.
Okay. A reminder, all the bios, we don't introduce people very much. It's all on the QR code. Just go online. You'll find everything there, English, French, and Spanish. And we're ready as soon as the presentation. You have to say next slide.
All right. They told me.
Okay.
Bonjour. It has to be red. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Bonjour, buenos dias, good morning to everyone. It's nice to see you all. It's great to be back in Canada. God, if the weather's like this, I should come more often, JC. I think this is the first time I've been to Ottawa where it hasn't been -10. So I want to thank you. I want to thank Carrie Lee, the Director General here of CAFM, for hosting us in this wonderful facility. What a great place. I've seen this on Zoom, and it really doesn't do it justice on Zoom. I was kind of wondering where you were, and now I have a good sense of where you were. It's wonderful to see a lot of old friends here that I've worked with now for some 20 years, from my colleagues at Ag Canada and CFIA to new colleagues at IDRC and the whole food chain here of Canada, as well as some old friends from 4-H that I'm really pleased flew all the way from Taiwan to join us here today. And I hope I don't put you to sleep and you can stay awake and it hasn't, the jet lag doesn't get to you. And also my friends at USDA who are here, Katie Nashur and I worked together many years ago, and Tyler, lots of Tylers here. It's nice to meet you all. So next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of Latin American food security. That's the real theme of the discussion, as well as the transformation of food systems that I'll get into a bit, and I might be a little critical of that, just coming from my kind of perspective of working for farmers for many years now. So Latin America is a rich, biodiverse, enormous part of planet Earth. 13% of global food production, 16% of agri-food exporters, the largest net exporter, meaning they export more than they import, and 16% of land biodiversity, 50% of biodiversity in the world. Forest cover, we all know about that, and of course, the 30% of the planet's fresh water, all important resources, all resources under threat, all resources too with opportunities. So for those of you who haven't been to Latin America, I really encourage a long trip there because it's a fabulous part of planet Earth, and it's an important partner to Canada and to the rest of the world, and it's really part of the breadbasket. At ICA, we represent all of the Americas, and sometimes because I work with a lot of Latin Americans, they always put Latin in front of America, and I always say, no, we represent the Americas. And that's starting in Canada to the north, going all the way down to Argentina in the south, and 14 member states in the Caribbean. You add Canada and the United States and Mexico to that, you double a lot of those numbers. And so the Americas is the breadbasket of the world, and it's very important that we work as a hemisphere, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So let's move on, please. Next slide. So as you can see, we are leaders in a lot of agri-food chains. You know what they are: wheat, soybean, corn, sugar, coffee, lots of fruits and vegetables. But in the tropical areas, those increases in growth are half the rate as in temperate areas. And so we're going to talk more about the tropics in a bit. But you can really look at the north and the south as the temperate regions that produce the most food. I'm looking at the Brazilian attaché now. Brazil's #1 in just about everything. It's a really tremendous agricultural power. But then in between those two areas, you have the tropics that are very important parts of planet Earth as well. Biodiverse, important culturally, important for global stability, and we're going to have to talk about research in those areas and in the food systems in those areas a lot more than we have in the past. Next slide, please. So it's a huge trading partner. Brazil's a huge chunk of that. As you can see, this is a heterogeneous region. And while Brazil exports $8 for everything imported, countries in the Caribbean are really not. They're import countries. And they have a goal of reducing imports by 25% by 2025. With COVID and everything else that's happened, that's not going to happen. But we have to think about how do we help the Caribbean invest in itself, and what kind of resources can we invest in family farms as well as in climate change and resilient agriculture in that part of the world, which is very important to our constituency. There are 14 votes out of 34 in our institution, and so we have to make sure that we're thinking about how to not just feed them with our own exports to that region, but how we can grow productive chains there to help complement what we send to them. Next slide, please. Malnutrition is a very sad thing to discuss, that here in the Americas we suffer from that. As you can see, compared to the world, 42%, Latin America and the Caribbean are not so bad off, but we still have problems. I'll talk a little bit about Guatemala, which is the third highest level of malnutrition in the world. And we just simply can't accept that. We shouldn't accept that. It's our neighbor, it's close to us. We could help that country improve malnutrition. There's an interesting technology called biofortification, and a great company that's working on that puts more zinc and iron into the corn through biofortification, from working with a lot of research centers, from CIMMYT to CIUT in Colombia, CIMMYT's in Mexico, but also with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, with a lot of different companies. How do we transform their corn into being more nutritious? You know, the Mayans have been growing corn for 2,000 years. A lot of economic development folks, they need to diversify away from that, go into berries. You know what? In 2,000 years from now, they're still going to be growing corn. How do we make that corn more nutritious? We've been transforming food since the Neolithic times. A lot of people don't want to transform food. They don't want to touch food. Human beings have been transforming food for thousands of years, so it's better today. Canada is a leading country for a lot of that science. How can we help them transform their food so that they're not the third largest or worst country with malnutrition in the world? As you can see, there's stark differences also between the Caribbean and Latin America. The next slide, please. And this kind of discusses the same subject. There's no reason for us to be hungry in the Americas and to have malnutrition. As you can see, in terms of the rest of the world, we have access to food. We have access to a lot of animal protein. I'll talk more about the importance of animal protein. But the Americas shouldn't be having any malnutrition given the supply of food in this region. Next slide. So the president of IFAD spoke a little bit about the fact that there's more poor and poverty in rural areas than in urban areas. There's more poverty in urban areas because there's more people, but percentage-wise, there's 44.8% in rural areas, and that's not acceptable. It's so tragic that the people growing the food are actually going hungry. So we need to figure out how to work on that, and that means investment in research, that means investment in those areas. Next slide. So this talks to some of the things that the president of IFAD was speaking about. 57 to 67% of family farming is responsible for what people consume. But greater than 60 million people are receiving their incomes from family farms also. That's an enormous amount of human beings. That's double Canada, almost, right? What's the population of Canada these days? 38. So it's approximately double, not quite double. In Central America, more than 60% of family farms are living in a state of poverty. I know that we have colleagues here from IFAD. I think the president is taking a tour of the farmer in bilateral meetings at this time, but there's been huge focus on the poverty in Asia and Africa. And there is poverty in both of those regions. There's poverty in the Americas too. We need to concentrate on the Americas. We don't want to neglect the rest of the world, but we need to focus on economic development in this part of the world as well so that we can feed the rest of the world. And so I urge Canada, my colleagues here in Canada, the Canadian government, the Canadian research agencies, the Canadian development agencies to think about Latin America, think about the Caribbean. We need to make sure that we have economic and political and food security in that region. As you see, Central America, the level of education's only 3 years, 50% lack access to electricity services. There's a lot of information that we can supply via cell phones, but if they don't have access to electricity, they're not going to have coverage to Wi-Fi either. We need to work on connectivity in the region, and we've done some studies with the IDB, with Oxford, with Microsoft, Syngenta, Bayer, others on that subject. We need to work on not just improving the food, but we need to give them access to the modern world as well to the extent we can. Next slide, please. Research. We need to research, spend more money on research in agriculture. You can see by the downward slope there on the right how research is not occurring in agriculture in the Americas. ICA was founded 80 years ago as a center for an Inter-American Center for Science, or Institute for Science. We're focused on research. We've moved more into technical capacity and left the research at our campus in Turrialba, which has the greatest coffee and cacao germplasm in the world. We encourage you to come visit that, but we need to focus on research. Just 2 weeks ago, John Charles, you came for that. We had a lot of the Prosi Norte group come for this as well. We had a meeting with the 1CGR system in the Americas, so IFPRI, SIPS, CIMMIT, CIAT, plus the World Bank and a bunch of others came to ICA to discuss research. We need the support of governments. Your support of AIM for Climate initiative, I think, is very important. We need to take that research and invest in the tropics. Big companies are investing in the temperate zones. We need to put some of that money into the tropics so that we have more research on certain crops, and I'll talk about one of those at the very end of this presentation. Next slide, please. Next slide. So COVID, we were hit with kind of a triple blow. We had COVID, we then had rising inflation, and that's continued, but it's abating somewhat. And then you add to that the war in Ukraine. And so that's had a real impact on food security and on the livelihood of, and the levels of hunger of people around the world. As you can see, the amount of people living in poverty is 33%. That's increased from just a few years ago, as has estimated severe poverty. So while there is growth, it's not keeping up with inflation. So inflation is really driving away the purchasing power of a lot of people, not just in Canada, but around the world. And so that's increasing the levels of poverty, especially in poor countries. Next slide. So everyone's heard about the transformation of food systems, which the UN has been talking about since the UN Food Systems Summit. These are some of the key areas where we need to intensify what we're doing for a transformation. I like to call it an improvement of food systems. The term transformation seems to me to say that the system's a failure. The system's not a failure. We just had a delicious breakfast here in Ottawa. You could have a delicious breakfast in the Caribbean, in South America, in Turkey, just about anywhere in the world. The food system works, but we can make it better. And these are some of the areas where we need to improve what we're working on. The director or the president of EFED talked about nutrition, very important, and climate, as well as youth and gender. Nutrition and climate are two of the things that we'll be talking about a little bit more in the next slide. So continue, please. So these are, ICA is an institution that works on public policy as well as projects. At the policy level, these are some of the areas where we're working to help our member states, from Canada to Argentina. Canada doesn't need our help, but some of the other countries don't have ministries of agriculture or parliaments as robust as Canada. And so we're helping them with the development of new policies that I would say are more climate resilient agriculture and all the components that focus on all of that and the measurement of all that, because that's important at the same. And ICA's an institute that helps the Americas work together on those policies. We've just launched an observatory of public policies. It's called OPSA. And I would encourage all of you when you're doing work on public policy to go to that website and see if that can be of assistance to you. And if it can't be, come talk to John Charles about it. Next slide, please. Next slide. So our strategy is to work at the country level. We have offices in all 34 countries of the Americas, and we have a John Charles, who's our representative here, in 34 countries. No other institute has that, and that's one of the things we're most proud of. It costs a lot of money to put all those people there and to have boots on the ground in 34 countries, and we're very grateful to the support and the assistance of Canada in that. Canada is our most, I'd say, reliable financier. And timely financier, and so we're very grateful for the support of Canada in everything we do. And then consensus building among the entire Americas is something I'm going to talk about next. Next slide. So I've mentioned the United Nations Food Systems Summit in 2021. In 2019, the UN One Planet system came to ICA with the goal of transforming our food systems. And they talked about what a failure our food systems were, and I was kind of offended by it. And the meeting was with hundreds of people, probably triple, quadruple the size of this, to talk about the transformation of food systems, and there wasn't a single farmer. There wasn't a single farm group. There wasn't a single company. There was one Minister of Agriculture from Switzerland. How can you talk about the transformation of food systems without farmers? So we worked with the whole buildup to the UN Food Systems Summit with many of the folks in this room. You might remember this was during a time of COVID. So COVID was actually, there was a silver lining to COVID, and that is the fact that we live in this technological era in which we can communicate via Zoom, via Teams, via Skype, via whatever method you have that my computer can never figure out which one is what, and I have to change my microphone. I know you all have the same problems. It was funny, just yesterday we were talking to people and they couldn't get on the mute to the audible portion, but that happens everywhere, all over the world. But thank God this pandemic came at a time where we had connectivity. And that connectivity enabled us to be talking to ministers all the time to make sure their food chain was working, to make sure there was enough food in their countries. It also enabled us to prepare for the Food Systems Summit, in which our Director General coined 3 key premises. One is that farmers need to be a part of the discussion. The second is that science needs to be the foundation for policy, not political science, not ideology, not perceived consumer preferences by government officials of what consumers really want, but science. And the third is that agriculture is part of the solution to our climate challenges. Sure, agriculture emits, agriculture contaminates, but we also have solutions to contaminate less and to improve our production and make it more precise. Next slide, please. So the third component of that, agriculture as part of the solution, became what our work plan has been since the Food Systems Summit, and it was building up to the COP27. And like for the Food Systems Summit, we gathered all of our ministers together in several meetings and developed an agenda that we submitted to the COP27. We also, thanks to the support of countries like Canada and the United States, I will not neglect that, we had the funds to train the ministries of agriculture of all 34 states to go to the COP and represent their agricultural ministries with their climate ministries in order to make sure agriculture had a seat at the table. And this was the first time and the strongest time, and the delegate from Mexico told me in Sharm el-Sheikh that this was the most significant presence by agriculture ministers from the Americas ever, or ministries from the Americas ever, and that was thanks to training of all of them. Next slide, please. So these are some of the commitments that we undertook with the ministers of agriculture at the COP27 to strengthen our sector, to bolster our role in the COPs, and I'll talk about that in a second, the COP28, to increase research and investment in climate areas, to strengthen mechanisms to facilitate all forms of knowledge, and that's where research is very important, and to continue to work on climate, just like it's one of the 4 pillars of EFAD. It's one of we have 9 pillars, we have a lot of pillars, but it's a very important component of almost everything we're doing. JC was at the AIM for Climate meeting in Washington last year, as I'm sure many of you were. Minister Bebeau was there, Secretary Vilsack, and the Secretary of Environment of the UAE was there, and they're the 2 main sponsors of AIM for Climate. And the Ministry of Environment and the presidency of COP28, which is in Dubai, invited ICA and all of its ministers to participate in a ministerial meeting there on agriculture, so that agriculture has a face and has a presence at the at the next COP in Dubai, and it's at the end of the year in November or December. Next slide, please. So, in leading up to that, we have a ministerial meeting, which is going to be in Costa Rica, that will then lead to our ministerial meeting in Dubai. These are some of the areas where we're having a seminar this week on digital agriculture. Last week was on science, and in the future we'll have it on all these different subjects, from trade to climate to One Health. And One Health is a key component. We've been talking about that with Ag Canada, with IDRC, with the Foreign Ministry. We're not meeting with Health, but Health Canada has been an important contributor to what we're doing on global food safety at Codex Alimentarius. Canada is a leader on that. But all these different areas, we're going to have forums that will lead to a hemispheric agenda on food security at our ministerial meeting in Costa Rica that will then take on to our ministerial in Dubai. Next slide. So I'm going to end with the banana. I told you I was going to talk about a tropical fruit, and I've been mentioning this everywhere because I don't know that everyone knows about this, but there's a disease called TR4, Fusarium rust race 4, which is in Africa, it's in Asia, and it arrived in Colombia 3 years ago. It's been pretty well contained in Colombia, but this is a disease that we really can't eradicate. We don't have any method to eradicate it. There's no resistance to this disease in the Cavendish variety of banana and in other Musaceae. We have a global alliance against TR4 that you could see there. We're calling it the Banana Trust also, but that has, as its participants, governments of the Americas, governments of the whole world where there are affected areas, international research institutions, and the 4 major banana companies. We are trying to raise money for this because what we're doing is really a race against time. And we're looking at 3 pillars of investment in this area. The first is biosecurity. We need to educate and communicate to farmers in Latin America and around the world, but right now in Latin America to prevent the spread, how to try to contain through biosecurity measures, fencing, changing shoes, washing things down, to make sure that workers and farmers and transportation vehicles and the millions of migrants that are moving from Venezuela and other parts of the world across the hemisphere are not transmitting this virus, which you can't see, you can't smell, you can't detect, but it gets into the soil, and once it's in the soil, it destroys the plant. We need to buy time. As we buy that time through investing in projects for biosecurity, we need to invest in research related to control. That's happening at Wageningen University, and research related to potential either conventional or genetic solutions. My guess is that it will be a gene-edited solution in which we can find some resistance to this disease. But we are in a campaign now to try and raise money in order to buy time against this eventual disease. And so I wanted to end with that because we think it's very important that you're aware of it. I don't know if we have another slide on this slide or not. I just deleted we had another slide that listed all the members of the alliance. But if you have Chiquita, Del Monte, Dole, and Fifes, the 4 big players of the banana as part of this alliance, you know that they're scared to death. And so we all should be pretty concerned as well, too. It's important for food security. I didn't know it, but bananas are the 5th most highly consumed food in the world. 400 million people around the world, at a minimum, depend on the banana, and a lot of them for their source of nutrition as well. So with that, John Charles, I'm done. I'm sure I've talked way over limits, so thank you.
Instead of questions now, if that's okay. Now that we're 10 minutes over time, I still want to build in some time for a break, for networking, to get more coffee, go hit the loo, anything like that. There's a virtual reality station. Takes about 15 minutes to finish that actual experience. So I'm going to say a break of 15 minutes. My apologies to the second panel. It cuts our time. I don't basically need closing remarks. I can do it in a minute. So I will suggest we start at 10:25, and we do the second panel till 11 sharp. And we have a hard stop at 11. If
John
that works.
Charles, I want to note for the record that Shannon's still awake. So good job,
Yeah.
Shannon.
Yes, from Taiwan, I understand. Yes. So if does that work for everyone? Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you, Lloyd. Well done. Thank you. Good presentation. Yeri, no c'est pas moi. ¿Qué pasó? ¿Sí? No, somos 5. Welcome back, everybody. We're taking one picture, I understand. Je suis désolé, là, ça me fait de la peine de vous couper la parole, mais on doit continuer. Sur l'agenda, là. On a pris un peu de retard, donc j'en profite tout de suite.
We're running a little late, so we will now. We're not going to do the presentations because you can scan the QR code, you can see the bios for all the speakers there. So we're not going to introduce the speakers.
Go straight into the discussion. I'm letting people grab their coffee, sit down in the room. Welcome back, everyone online. And it's a different format where it's not like formal presentations, it's a conversation. So I'm going to start with Ron. A reminder, just like Magali, if you need headsets, they're in the back on the right for interpretation. So basically the topic you've understood from this morning, it's family farming. It's climate change, it's climate resilience, it's the future of the sector, it's farmer organizations. So they're part of the solution to sustainable development for themselves and for the world. We are a major important continent for the breadbasket for the planet. And you saw Lloyd's presentation. So we have today with us IFAD, IDRC, Canada's Federation of Agriculture, and Quebec's Federation of Agriculture. In French, we call it l'Union des producteurs agricoles. So I'm going to start with Ron. Basically, the question is focused around how can we scale up solutions? The focus is on development solutions, on achieving our 2030 agenda, on achieving food insecurity, challenges that we have today in the Americas. So it's the decade of family farming. We're about 4 years in, I'm going by memory. What have we learned so far? Best practices, lessons learned from a farmer organization to my left point of view, and from a research and IFAD point of view. I'd like to start with Ron, please.
Thanks, JC. Good morning, colleagues. Very nice to see you all. Very nice to see many familiar faces through G20 processes and former IFAD colleagues, etc. It's a real honor to be here in Canada. It's my first time in Canada, mainly because I heard it was cold here, but I see that's not the case. Lloyd made a really fantastic presentation before, and I think it took a lot of the data and details that I was going to try and provide. So I'll focus on maybe 4 points. Firstly, a little bit about IFAD and the work that we do to build on what our president was saying this morning. Perhaps a little bit of a reflection on family farming from our perspective and why this is important. A little bit on the UN Decade of Family, and perhaps a few thoughts on way forward and the role that Canada can play. So IFAD itself, as you heard from our president this morning, we're quite a unique animal in terms of we're both an international financing institution and we're a specialized agency of the United Nations. We have been, we were born in the 1970s in response to the then food and energy crisis. And a lot of the rationale for establishing IFAD mirror some of the global challenges that we face today. Lack of focus on local production, making sure that farmers have the right kind of financial support, etc. Over the time that IFAD's been in place, there's a number of things that characterize the work that we do. Firstly, as we've heard from various presenters this morning, a majority of the world's poorest and most marginal people are in rural areas. We also know that a lot of the most food insecure people are actually farmers. So the work that IFAD does and with our partners such as the other Rome-based agencies has never been more critical. Also, in terms of what IFAD does, we specifically target and focus on small-scale farmers and marginalized rural people. So what we really do is in the tagline. We're a dedicated agency for family farming and small scale. We don't do anything else. And that focus for us is very important, and that's also important for many of our member states. We benefit more small scale farmers than almost any other organization in the world. Over 130 million small-scale farmers benefit from our support and services each year. We work globally, covering all regions, and have done for 45 years. As a multilateral organization, what's really important about the work that we do is we provide predictable financing and have been able to build long-term trusted relationships with our member states. And it was interesting yesterday when we met with some of the deputy and assistant deputy ministers from Global Affairs. There were some questions around how we deal with difficult policy issues, how we deal with sticky discussions that we have with governments. And the way that we do that, of course, is because we've got these long-term relationships. So we're able to have a dialogue around what kind of changes need to be put in place, no matter how difficult. And as a multilateral organization, there's a trusted relationship that they know is going to be long-term. Another characterization of the work that IFAD does is our focus on results. And many of our Global Affairs Canada colleagues know that IFAD is a leader in the results space. We measure in a great deal of detail the impact that we have on farmers and on agriculture. And as I mentioned before, for us it's about building the livelihoods and building the opportunities for farmers. The final point that I'll say about IFAD is, as a finance institution, one of the important value additions that we bring is we're able to leverage our balance sheet and leverage different resources to deliver more impact. And this is particularly important in the current environment where I'm sure the Minister was rushing off to Parliament to have a discussion on the budget that Canada is putting forward. Making sure that us in the development space are able to tell to taxpayers a story around how their dollars are being leveraged and invested and demonstrate and achieve results is really important. So for IFAD, every dollar that a Canadian taxpayer gives us, we know that we convert and leverage that into $6 of investment on the ground. And that's very important, particularly as an organisation that, like all of us, doesn't have the resources to deal with the global food security challenges that we have. We need to work in partnership and find ways of leveraging and crowding in and bringing additional finance, because the challenges of global food security are really challenging. In terms of family farming, this is obviously very central to our philosophy and what we focus on. And I think Lloyd gave a really good summary of the importance of family farming. Whether it's around the importance of food security, majority of food, particularly in developing countries, comes from small and family farms. Whether it's around sustainable practices and maintaining biodiversity that small farms do. We know that small farms have different sort of cropping patterns and have different types of biodiversity on their farms, and that's important for overall sustainability. We also know in developing countries that the rural development and livelihoods aspect of small farms is critically important. It's a key employer in rural areas, particularly for young people. It delivers livelihood. It helps build incomes. And for me, after spending 25 years working with IFAD in the field, these kind of aspects are really important. You know, I've never met a woman farmer or a farming family that hasn't wanted to leverage their agriculture to improve their livelihoods, to improve the education of their family, to make sure that the future is much more brighter than they face now. And small-scale agriculture and family farming can deliver that. There's an important cultural aspect to family farming as well. And I was really impressed with the tour that we had at this facility this morning. I haven't seen anything anywhere else in the world, actually, that focuses like it does here, of that mix of science and technology, but also heritage. And what you said this morning was really interesting about how you try and educate people that visit here. That science and technology and advancing agriculture doesn't mean a loss of heritage. It doesn't mean unsustainable practices. And with family farms, that's something that we try and project. We don't want to hold development back for any type of ideology, but we want to make sure that the livelihoods are built in a sustainable way and it protects people and planet in the way that we do it. The final point on family farming is the poverty reduction elements. Lloyd's details and data on the disadvantages that small-scale and family farmers have is really important. And what our impact assessment data shows is that there is opportunities to improve incomes and improve livelihoods through small-scale farming. Very quickly, on the UN Decade of Family Farming, so this was a major event that built on the year of family farming, and someone can correct me, which I think was around 2014. And under the United Nations, there was a decade that was declared. IFAD and the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, FAO, are co-leads, I think we call ourselves, to help implement the decade. Underneath the decade, there is a global action plan for the implementation of the decade. And this focuses on a few really key elements. The first element is making sure that the right kind of policies are in place to support small-scale farmers and farming. Another priority is around capacity building and knowledge, so that small-scale farmers have access to appropriate technologies, appropriate knowledge that can build on their traditional knowledge and improve their productivity and livelihoods. The decade focuses very strongly, and rightly so, on gender and equality. We know in developing countries, as someone said, I think it was you, JC, on the feminization of agriculture and how important that is. For us at IFAD, a farmer would most likely have a female face, and that has a huge impact on the way that we support and the way that we deliver, but it also has huge returns on investment in terms of what a family, what the proceeds and improvements of livelihood repay in terms of family. The final point on the decade, which I think is really important, is the opportunity to come together under multi-stakeholder type platforms and partnerships. If you weren't scared by some of the data that was thrown at you this morning, just in terms of the extent of global food security, and this is not a new crisis. You know, we're still really in the crisis from 2008 in terms of food prices, etc., and we haven't done enough to address some of the structural issues that we face as an international community. And I think some of the data that Lloyd put forward this morning really highlights the fact that we can't, as an international community, continue to have short-term thinking around food security. If not, we're going to regain and retain this hand-out rather than hand-up type mentality. And that's something that we at IFAD advocate very strongly. So how we come together collectively to recognise family farming, how we make sure we've got the right policy frameworks, the right kind of investment, and the right kind of partnerships to support family farming is really critical in our perspective.
Excellent. Thanks for setting the stage. Ron, I'd like to then invite a Canadian subnational perspective from l'Union des producteurs agricoles. I understand Magali will be giving her a talk in French.
Bonjour à tous. En bonne québécois, je vais effectivement parler en français.
Good morning, everyone. I will be speaking in French. I will speak slowly. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Quebecois accent, I am the Deputy Director General of the Agricultural Canadian Producers Association. There's a number of farmers in the Quebec territory. I wanted to tackle the topic of food security from a territorial perspective, because I think that this topic needs to be tackled at a territorial level based on the area you're in. For example, I'll speak of Quebec because I know Quebec well, but I want to broaden it to the national and international level as well. At the province level, we are fortunate in Quebec to have a highly structured organization wherein farmers have been able, through time, this organization has existed and has empowered them with tools to access the market collectively. It's one way of guaranteeing certain food security because we preserve production at a local level and we offer our products directly according to the demand. This also allows farmers to have a source of income that is stable, and it allows them to keep family enterprises operating throughout the territory, because the implementation of products on the market is made mutual. This is fantastic to guarantee food security of the populations, especially during the pandemic. We did not experience a lot of problems with the supply chain because we already had implemented these systems. It also is related to the territory. In Quebec, we have areas that are highly concentrated, but thanks to these tools, we have the presence of a local economy throughout the territory because we generate local economy. This allows us to have families, schools, entire towns throughout all of Quebec. Likewise, when we speak of adaptation to climate change, this type of agriculture is much more resilient to the challenges, to political problems, economic problems, even from a social perspective, an environmental perspective, because it gives us the possibility of developing certain programs and certain public policies that can be implemented directly on site to work with farmers throughout Quebec. There are many programs that allow, through research, through scientists, measure the impacts of climate change at the farm level. There's one, we have farms that are able to measure the impacts, but there's also a possibility for farms to be the solution to climate change. I heard this morning. Agriculture is both a problem and a solution when in terms of climate change. So at the farm level, we can go and seek developing good agricultural practices. We are also able to participate in carbon offsets thanks to this organization that is highly structured. By implementing projects wherein farmers are at the center. It's very important. I heard it this morning as well. Farmers must be at the center of the solution. They must be part of developing the solution, just like researchers. This is something we discussed this morning. It's that kind of spirit of participating around the same table, and farmers are at the center. This is very important to evolve the sector and to make progress and to make sure that scientific research is applied directly on site for farmers. At the Quebec level, at the Canadian level as well, the international side of PA, which is international development, here we have the country director, Mr. Angelier, who worked at the international scale in approximately 15 countries in cooperation with approximately 60 organizations, many of which are producers. And our philosophy in Quebec is to try and share it also abroad. This philosophy is based on the fact that farmers are well organized through organizations that are able to implement a few projects together with other organizations. For example, I know that there are certain things that have been done, several programs that allow implementing certain types of projects with farmers organizations. And at the Americas level, we also have efforts in the Caribbean, in Bolivia, Peru. And likewise, we have presence in Africa, Asia. And therefore, this experience has been developed based on the work that we carry out currently in Quebec. There are several aspects that are based on what we do. We have people who work in cooperation with local organizations, with agricultural farmers who go on site, share experiences, and with other farmers who come to see what we are doing in Quebec, meaning it's an exchange of capacity building. It's a cooperation with researchers involved as well, where we have a concerted effort focused on development at the end of the day. And it's been well structured. And I also wanted to speak of the International Working Plan, which our organization currently has. We have a very ambitious project, which has been operating since 2018, with a coalition for sustainable food. And the idea behind this is to have an international agreement on sustainable nourishment. It's an ambitious project, but we can also say that it's been very important in order to define public policies that will allow us to strengthen the tools, the policies, the programs for food production at the national scale level, to include agriculture and the food security of each country, and in particular at the international level, to look at nourishment, not just about producing for the economic side of things. We always must integrate social and environmental aspects as well. I don't know if you followed me so far, but at the level of international trade, we don't only look at economic aspects and financial exchanges for the food side of things, because we must also take into account things that are essential for life itself. And that's why the idea is to exchange all of these parameters, and why this coalition, together with civil society and farmers, work together, and with other organizations as well, and with some African coalitions as well, to mobilize the sector in order to really have an agreement that is resilient to climate change, that protects biodiversity, and that is focused on the efforts that we've carried out here in Quebec with relation to cultural diversity. Because the idea is we need to prioritize local production, but also promote culture. So, well, I think that we also need to tackle food security at different levels. And I think that the key is in the local plans that we have to see what we're missing when we have people that could be structuring all of the food side. I think we can all benefit from this. Well, we could do a workshop perhaps with all of these topics. Yes, I know. I tried to summarize things, but well, now we can have this agricultural model as an organization for excellence in the Americas, which I think is quite interesting. It's a model that we could copy and share, and maybe we can follow it. Right, Santiago, next, please.
I am with the IDRC, the CRDI, français. So you don't know what IDRC is, a Crown Corporation, the International Development Research Center. We have a mandate from the Parliament of Canada for the last 50 years to support research in developing countries and to support researchers. And I want to probably focus a little bit on the role of research in food security, the role of research with smallholder farmers, with family farmers, and some of the expertise and lessons that we have learned recently, in particular in Latin America, on the impact of COVID in food security, because I think we can learn a lot of how smallholder farmers and their capacity to respond to the COVID crisis responds to any other crisis. And we are seeing many of the results that we have found actually relate to the conversation that we are having right now. The first element that I want to focus is the role of research, and probably what research means in terms of what is how we transform. And I think this morning we have been transforming food systems for the last 14,000 years, and agriculture has been there. So farmers have been doing research for 14,000 years, and we don't have to forget that. That's one of the areas where research and knowledge translation and knowledge sharing is actually transforming a lot of the dialogue around research. Last year, IDRC launched a new initiative, a group of initiatives, in particular focused in the Americas, working on the role of indigenous knowledge and indigenous researchers in the transformation of more resilient food systems to climate change. The idea is to connect two worlds together, two ways of thinking and two ways of looking at solutions that can actually work hand in hand. And it's the more Western traditional knowledge and research with the more traditional indigenous knowledge. And we are actually working right now in five
projects across the Americas with indigenous universities. That's one of the key elements. The other element is who does the research. This is a clear panel that shows us what is the reality of agriculture research. Only 20% of the agriculture researchers are women. We have only 20% of women in this panel, while more than 50% of the farmers are women. So we need to, there's a gap there that we have a responsibility to focus and to solve. Otherwise, we are not going to have the best solutions. We don't do gender we don't do gender transformative, or we don't integrate gender into the research in agriculture only because it's the right thing to do, that it will be enough. But it's also the smart thing to do, is good research. And we are doing that in IDRC across many of our programs by taking a decision some years ago of we have not funding any gender-blind project, because we know that the best agriculture, the best food program, understand the whole complexity of the solution, of the problems that we are trying to solve. The other element is, going back to the idea of complexity, we are facing two crises, climate crisis and inequality crisis. That means that we cannot find or come with easy solutions to complex problems. And in that moment, we will realize that agriculture and research in agriculture will be only one of the pieces of the complex puzzle of food insecurity. And is the piece that some of us probably love the most, because we were trained on that, because we grow up in farms, and we see, and it's easy to explain to policymakers, it's easy to explain to communities that we cultivate food, therefore we feed more people. But the reality is that we know that that's not enough. There's an element of transformation of society, access to education, access to infrastructures, access to dialogue, markets, that is going to be more complex than only the productivity aspect. And that dialogue needs to be there. Those two crises bring us another concept that I think is very important, IDRC is paying a lot of attention, is the urgency of the response. We don't have time. The climate crisis is literally giving us 10 years to come up with solutions. And in many of the countries in the tropics, it's not going to be a 1.5 degrees scenario. It's going to be close to a 2, where 2 reality is urgent. The last thing that I want to say in that one is that in the results and the analysis that we have done, looking at the impact of COVID, for instance, of one key crisis in the food security, family farmers are being more resilient to change than other farming systems. They probably are not being the richest out of the situation, but we are seeing places like in Ecuador where the severe food insecurity is double in urban areas that it was in the urban areas where family farmers were able to adapt. We have seen negative impacts as well, increase of child labor, or the role of women much stretching on their daily labor. But they were able to respond and to adapt to the crisis. And then, that for me, the last message is there's many of the lessons on that adaptive capacity that the smallholder farmers have that we can actually translate now into an agenda of building resilience in the climate crisis. I probably want to stop here because I see you have 5 minutes.
Sí.
So,
Muchísimas gracias, genial. No. That's another workshop we could do just for you right there. And love it. It's, women feed the world and moms are awesome. I wish we had more time, but I do want to give Keith and the Canadian Federation justice, and I've negotiated a few extra minutes for you.
Well, thanks very much. And one of the dangers of going last is that people have already said what you were going to say, and or you run into the problem of potentially contradicting what they said. But thank you for the opportunity. It's great to be here. And it's very fitting that we're talking about this from my perspective. I just come back from a week in Africa, and although this is a conversation about the Americas, certainly getting a perspective of what was going on the ground in Africa certainly is very relatable to what we're talking about today. And, when we talk about sustainability, one of my biggest struggles is whose definition are we using? What does that mean? Because it means something different to not only every country, But even subnationally, it means a big difference regionally. When you look at a country like Canada that's so vast and diverse geographically and from an agricultural industry, you heard Magali talk about what's going on in Quebec, and I come from Ontario, and we're very similar to what the way that Quebec is as far as, you know, our natural capital assets of soil and climate and our ability to produce. But when you go further east to Atlantic Canada, it's a whole different farming atmosphere. And when you go west to Western Canada, and I'll talk about the prairies and specifically, that's much different, as is British Columbia on the west coast. So now you've got this diversity of agriculture that you're trying to find a way to fit sustainability narratives into. That's very difficult. And really, when we talk about family farming, I look at Canada, and 98% of the farms in Canada are family owned and operated. But the family dynamics look different in Canada than they used to. Our farms are big, getting bigger. We still have a lot of small farms as well. But when you look at the family narrative, we used to think about it as grandparents and parents and children. And we still have those dynamics, but now we also have aunts and uncles and cousins and their siblings, and the family dynamics is getting bigger because the farms are getting bigger, but it's still family owned and operated. The term corporate farming always runs I get a shiver down my spine when I hear that, because that term tends to mean that it's negative when it comes to agriculture. But the reality is our farming operations in this country and in North America in particular are incorporating, so they're corporate operations. And so there's that negative tone towards agriculture, which we need to get rid of, because it's also getting in the way of our fantastic sustainability initiatives that we're doing here. And some of the problems that we face, which aren't unique to North America, but really around the world, is how do we dance around the political game that we have to play, depending on the country that you're in. For the most part in North America, I think politicians or political parties want to do the right thing for agriculture. I'm not sure that's the case when you get into Latin and South America. And how do we balance that in our fight to bring people up? And I love the term hand up, not hand out. That's a perfect way to put it. When you talk about 14,000 years of research, I research every day on my farm. That's what farmers do. So I can certainly relate to that research going on. And it really is the common missing link that we have in agriculture. We just don't have that robust research that's made available to us. And when we look at where governments are going on climate change, and you know, we heard from Minister Bibeau this morning, but every mandate letter to every cabinet minister here in Canada has a climate change aspect to it. And certainly that's okay, but it can't override all the other good things that we're doing and take a precedent over doing the right thing in agriculture. And when we talk about sustainability in Canada, you know, we look at it as a three-prong approach. And certainly at the forefront of it is the environmental aspect of it. But going back to what I just mentioned about our mandate letters on climate change, we're so focused on carbon and carbon sequestration. But as a farmer, I can't do one specific initiative in the environmental arena. When I do something to improve the environment, it has multiple co-benefits. So in order for me to sequester carbon, I have to make sure I start with healthy soils. That is the basis of all things we do. And healthy soils will not only sequester carbon, but it'll help water flow through the soil. It improves plant health. It retains nutrients. There's multiple benefits of that. So we can't just look at carbon sequestration in the environment file as a one-off when it comes to agriculture. It's got to be a bigger picture. So it can't just lie in the hands of farmers or the Minister of Agriculture. We have to talk about environment ministries. We have to talk about natural resources ministries. We have to talk about infrastructure ministries, because we need technology to help us really drive this forward. We have to talk about finance. You know, and that's another pillar of what I'm talking about. Environmental strong, but we also have to talk about the economics of this. We can't do it if we don't make money. If we don't make money, we go broke and we stop farming. You know, and so we have to make sure that's important. And we also have to consider the social governance aspect of what we do. And that's where food security comes into play. But also what's creeping into the social governance, which Lloyd talked about earlier, is we have to stick to science-based or evidence-based decision-making. We cannot let emotions drive what we do because, you know, emotion is a wonderful thing to have. It's an excellent driver. You just cannot let it control you because quite often irrational decisions are made in haste. And while Santiago talked about, you know, we're in a crisis and we only have 10 years to go, what if we don't get there? What's more important is that we're on the right path going up. And if it's not 10 years, maybe it's 15, but we're going in the right direction. And I think we need to have that overarching picture of how we do this. So, you know, we're all rowing in the same boat. We just have to make sure we row in the same direction as we go forward. And I think these kind of conversations, and I would love Lloyd to be invited on a Latin American tour of farms because, trust me, you know, after what I saw in Africa, I'm very encouraged and discouraged in both aspects about what's happening, but encouraged about how we can take our knowledge and our skills and how we learn from them as well to better improve what we're doing here in Canada. And so, you know, certainly I think, you know, we have some opportunities here, especially on the food security aspect to really, really drive things forward. So I'm looking forward to where we go next.
Good message, Keith. Thanks. I'd like to open all the mics so that we can have a bit of a conversation. I think Ron wanted to react right away.
Great. No, just really to what Keith was saying, and thank you for the insights. The aspect that you said before around the importance of agriculture not being isolated, its interlinkages with environment, with economics, with social aspects is really important. And in the presentation that Lloyd made before, there was something on the Food System Summit, and probably each of us in this room has a different definition of what food systems is, if you understand it all, because it's very conceptual. But the interrelation and the importance of agriculture and the centrality of it for life, for well-being, for livelihoods, is a key opportunity globally. And I think we need to be focusing on that. And that's something that perhaps is starting to emanate in some countries, such as Canada, where you're looking at those, you know, those interlinkages between different sectors, and that's really important. The second thing that I just wanted to react to is on the importance of finance. And one thing we haven't had time or opportunity to do is to talk about the role of the private sector in the provision of support and services. For us at IFAD, the private sector is these family businesses. It's a farmer itself rather than the big sort of international agro industry. And how we support those private sector actors to provide support and services is really critical. One of the key lessons that we learnt in COVID was when things shut down, in developing countries, it was those small, micro, medium enterprises that continued to provide support and services, inputs to farmers, finance to farmers, etc. So making sure that we've got the right approach to ensure that private sector is able to grow, farmers are able to grow, access finance is really important. The final thing that I'll say is linked to climate. I think that we're naive if we think that particularly family farmers and small-scale farmers have the capacity to take on new risks, have the capacity to take on the challenges of climate without support. And that's going to require public, it's going to require private investment and partnerships in being able to move forward, because small-scale farmers don't have the capacity for risk to be able to adapt without the right kind of support. And that's where thinking needs to happen. How can we create the right incentives in supply chains to incentivize more sustainable agricultural practices? How can we ensure that they are appropriate for small-scale farmers? And that's a really key challenge for us in the developing, but also the developing world.
Oh, no, totally. I mean, I think when I was given the 10 years, and I was actually thinking in adaptation, not even in mitigation, I was thinking on the responses that we need to provide. We need to put on the hands of farmers all the tools in the toolbox, because what is not even coming, what is happening, is going to actually undermine all their capacity. And I think one of the key elements that we are looking at from the research agenda is what are the trade-offs of every time that we have an alternative food systems, we know that there's going to be trade-offs. And we have developed a whole agenda of research that not only looks at the new solutions, but what is happening with this new solution and who is being left behind on this solution. Because we cannot be so naive to think that we have a silver bullet that will solve everything. And I think that complexity of reaching the 10 years by being able to be there is critical. I think that's a critical balance that we have to pay attention to.
Yeah, and you know, the political aspect of what we do is often lost in this because, you know, it takes a strong government structure. I mean, I forget who mentioned it earlier this morning. They talked about agriculture being, you know, 10% of the climate change problem. But what nobody's talking about is agriculture is 20% of the solution. Why aren't we focusing on that? And this is where our governments around the world could say, okay, yeah, we understand where the risks are within agriculture, but we understand where the benefits and the rewards are. So how do we work together to promote that to go forward? And that's the struggle that we have every day.
J'aimerais rajouter, nous avons, je pense, tous en commun le fait de dire que la recherche.
Ahora con el with this point of view that the agriculture and the different actors have to work together, how to move forward the agricultures to have more productivity. We're saying that we have more and more regulations, frameworks that force us to go in certain way, because as a matter of fact, it is not true that the producers can take more risks to adapt and have better practices. That is risky financially, that is risky in terms of the business. So the measures like these ones does not work. We have to work through investigation, through the public partners, and accompany them and support them and work together in the same line, that so in a way that it's not a burden for the companies. Thank you very much.
Farmers, farms are getting bigger, and the next generation of farmers don't have access to buy their own family farms anymore and be the next generation. We talk that women have also, in other countries, in developing countries, lack the access to land. But what we are seeing is that also here, soon the next generation won't have access to their own family farm. It's getting bigger. It's an economic, of course, you know, also incentive to have a bigger farm and have more people involved. But what's going to happen? And I'd like to hear more, you maybe also, but on the research side as well, like what you're seeing about these next generation.
Merci.
So that's an interesting question. It's one that I get a lot, and I was saying this to Serge earlier, but one thing that shocked people when I talked to them is, believe it or not, I used to be young. And when I bought my first farm off my parents, the interest rate was 19.5%. And in today's world, you never would do that, but I wanted a farm so bad, I made it work. And you're right, the farming operations are bigger. The money involved is incredibly onerous financially on people, to the point where they have to make a tough decision whether they want to get into farming or not. Part of the reason why a lot of our farm operations are incorporating these days is because the transition becomes easier as an incorporated business versus just a sole ownership type of business. But I will say that if there's a will, there's a way. And I know that mortgage rates are tough right now with interest rates climbing. And I know that we have done a much better job in agriculture in the last, I'll say, 10 years in succession planning in general. Whereas before it was, oh yeah, whenever you're ready, we'll take over. But there was never a conversation on how it would happen. And so I think we're better than actually most people want to believe. Yes, is it hard for young farmers to get into agriculture? Yes. But if you can't get into a family operation, perhaps there's a neighbor or someone that you can talk to about becoming a part owner in that operation. There's lots of options out there, and I don't have the same kind of fear as I'm hearing out there about getting into agriculture, because I'm basing that on my own experience. I wanted to farm, so I figured out how to do it. And it's no different if you go out into any other business in any other industry. It's tough to get into those as well. But I think there needs to be an emphasis on agriculture, from society's perspective because it's about food. And it's not just about when we look at what we've gone through COVID, where not only is agriculture recession-proof, but it's also now we know it's COVID-proof. And to the point earlier, things continue to be produced through COVID. And so that economic aspect of what agriculture can bring, that aspect alone should encourage governments to make sure they invest in ways they can financially back young farmers to get in, or low-interest loans, or some kind of other financial incentives to increase the youth getting into agriculture these days. I think that's what we have to look at doing going forward.
Thanks, Keith. One last reaction from Ron, and then we'll close.
Yeah, I mean, that was a really good question. I'm Australian and from a farm, and I migrated for education, and we've got some of the most consolidated farming globally. And from an economic perspective, as Keith said, you can understand, because to make a farm work, you need some kind of scale of production, market access, all of those kind of factors. And these are all policy. From our perspective, and a developing country perspective, the economic viability of farm is one aspect that you would assess. There's also cultural heritage, tradition, all of these kind of things that need to come into play. And we've, I think, over the course of IFAD's history, learnt a lot around how to make agriculture profitable and business-like, and how to create the right kind of incentives for the right kind of approaches. And there isn't really a magic solution or answer to this, but getting policy frameworks right to support agriculture is fundamental anywhere. On young farmers, from a developing country perspective, if you look at the population demographics in a lot of developing countries, the majority of young people in rural areas are young. And you've got issues with land availability, fragmentation, etc. in developing countries, where farming for them in a traditional sense can't be a future. And that creates all kinds of social pressures in rural areas of developing countries. Many of you work in sub-Saharan Africa, and if you look at what kind of challenges come out of migration, what kind of challenges come out of young people looking for opportunities and moving into extremism or some other kind of non-social type activity, because they don't have the opportunities to develop themselves, they don't have the opportunities for employment or livelihood. And that's something that we need to safeguard. For us at IFAD, we recognise that the agricultural sector in developing countries doesn't have the absorptive capacity for the bulk of youth. But the agricultural sector does provide other off-farm opportunities that need to be developed, so that we can create incentives for young people to not want to migrate to a city, to become an urban poor, not to join extreme groups, not to migrate to Europe or wherever else, but to stay in their rural areas and invest in their communities. And when you talk to young people, that's what they do. That's what they want. They want these kind of opportunities. For us, a key lesson has been around what kind of farming that we want to put forward to young people. And the traditional bleeding heart, ideological type viewpoint of farming, of having a person with manual labor in a field, which makes a great picture for a development organization such as us. But it's not a great incentive for a young person who wants to be in the sun with rudimentary technology, etc. What young people want, from our experience and knowledge, is they want science. They want access to technology. They want access to finance. They want access to employment. And they want farming as a business. And again, that doesn't mean moving to unsustainable practices away from tradition and culture, but it's about modernization in the right kind of way. And that's really what we're trying to do in developing countries with trying to further agriculture in a more appropriate way.
Thank you.
JC, can I make one just real quick comment?
Of course, please.
Something else we need to think about in all of this, and it's relevant in every country around the world, is we also have to think about the mental health aspect of all this, because that plays a really important role in how we go forward.
Yes, fully agree. And ending on a youthful note, please join me in thanking the panel. I know we went over. I appreciate everyone is still here. This is, you know, like in class when I teach at U of Ottawa, the food, and they're still 11 o'clock at night. I'm like, it's a good sign. Few. I know no one's looking at their phone, which is even more, for me, that's also a positive sign. There's also an excellent session tomorrow at McGill. I think it's full, but it's available online, Janelle? On person? And you're full? Almost full. So Chanel at McGill, there's an event tomorrow, Soko de Vie. Excellent, I recommend it. My thanks to IFAD and for their support. My thanks to the panelists. Apologies that we cut it short, but we were able to negotiate extra time. Thanks to the tech, to the interpreters in Costa Rica. Thanks for the food. All of you traveled, many of you from very far to be here. Fond du cœur, merci beaucoup. It's a joy to see a lot of friends and partners. I hope we do this again, and I'm going to build in more time. But stay safe. All the best to your families. And any... No, that's it? Okay, we're good? All right, merci beaucoup. Take care, everybody.